Good morning. We're learning Tractate Eruvin, Tractate Eruvin, chapter 1. The name of the chapter is Mavishu Gavoya, and we're holding page Daled. So the top of the page says Shaloy Mechovanos. Let me text. Okay, so Shaloy Mechovanos on top, it says that they should not be exactly alike. What does it mean? That the same tefach should not be used for all applications. So we mentioned yesterday about how do you measure an amma. So it says tefach, 4 tefach, 5 tefach, 6 tefach for an amma. So that's really between 18 inches to 26, 25 inches. It says they should not be exactly the same or alike. The same tefach should not be used for all applications. Rather, sometimes a larger tefach should be used, and other times a smaller tefach should be used, depending on the law involved. This bias is understandable according to Rava, since the first part, that all amma units be measured using the 6 tefach amma, accords with Rav Nachman's view, according to Rava's version. The second part, too, which states that they should not be exactly alike, does not contradict the first statement. Rather, it means so that these, the amis mentioned in regard to kilaim, should be loose, and these, the amis mentioned in regard to sukkah, should be tight. So in sukkah we are stringent, and regarding the kilaim we are stringent. Ela by kasha, but the Brisa poses a difficulty to Abaye, since it clearly mandates the use of 6 tefach amma for all amma units. Unlike Abaye's version of Nachman's statement, which requires using the 5 tefach amma for the laws of Sukkah and Movet. So Abaye will tell you, Ema amas kilaim b'amma vashisha. Explain the Brisa to mean that all amma units mentioned in the context of kilaim are measured using an amma of 6 tefachim, which would mean that you need a greater clearance, a greater distance from the vineyard. But it does not refer to amma units mentioned in the context of other laws. But from what is taught in the end of this Baisa, Gamliel says, Kol amas shamu chacham b'chilaim b'amma b'shisha. All the amma units that the sages mentioned in regard to kilaim are measured using an amma of 6 tefachim. Ubilvad shelo mitzumtzam is provided they should not be precise. They should not be tight tefach amis, rather loose tefach amis must be used. Miklad Tanakama kol amis kama. This implies that the Tanakama refers to all amma units regardless of the context in which they are mentioned. The Gemara accepts this proof that Tanakama indeed referred to all laws. Nevertheless, but isn't there Rabbi Gamliel who concurs with me? I said myself, my statement in accordance with the view of Rabbi Gamliel. According to Abaye, it is certainly a dispute between the Tanoim of the Brisa whether all amma units are measured using the 6 tefach amma. L'Rava milema tanoi. According to Rava, is it not? According to Abaye, is it not certainly dispute between the Tanoim of the Brisa whether all amma units are measured using 6 tefach amma? L'Rava milema tanoi. But according to Rava, must we say that it is a matter of dispute between the Tanoim of this Brisa? Amar leCharava. Perhaps not. Rava will tell you that Rav Nachman's view accords even with the view of Rabbi Gamliel. Why then does Rabbi Gamliel speak only about the laws of kilaim? Rabbi Gamliel also lashmuinan amas kilaim lo yitzamtzum. Rabbi Gamliel comes to teach us the following: when measuring the amma units of the laws of kilaim, you're trying to figure out the proper clearance of kilaim. Especially when it comes to the vineyard, we know the machlokes is between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel obviously is more lenient, 16 or 24. But how do you measure the amma? So it tells you, amas kilaim lo yitzamtzem. one should not be precise when it comes to the laws of Kilaim, but he should add a little extra. He should use loose tefach amas, not precisely. Take a little bit more space. Let him say simply, when measuring the amma units of the laws of Kilaim, one should not be precise, but he should use loose tefach amas. Why wasn't it said very clearly? What did he mean to exclude by stipulating that an amma units of 6 tefachim should be used for the laws of Kilaim? Is this not meant to exclude the amma units mentioned in the context of Sukkah and of Maveh, to teach that we use the 5 tefach amma in those cases? The Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel may have meant to exclude the amma units mentioned in the context of the base of the temple altar, and the amma units mentioned in the context of the ledge that encircled the temple altar. It's written in Yechezkel 43:13, in prefacing the description of the altar's dimension. Ve'ela midas hamizbeach ba'amis amma. Ve'ela midas hamizbeach ba'amis amma v'toifach. And these are the dimensions of the altar in amis, of an amma and a tefach. What does it mean? So it comes to tell us in terms of the small tefach amma, if 5 tefach amas, meaning each amma would consist of 5 tefachim. And the base shall be an amma, and the width an amma. Ugvula es foso soviv zeres ha'echad. And its border to its edge all around shall be 1 span, half an amma. And this is the top of the altar. The Gemara now explains this verse, which lists the parts of the altar whose measurements were given in terms of the 5 tefach amma. The base shall be an amma. This refers to the base of the altar. And the width an amma. This refers to the ledge that encircled the altar. And its border to its edge all around. This refers to the horns on top of the altar. And this is the top of the altar. This refers to the golden altar in the sanctuary. The laws governing standards of measure, interpositions, and partitions are laws given orally to Moshe at Sinai, but which have no scriptural basis. Shiurin deoraisu, but the laws governing measures have a biblical source. Tichtiv, Eretz chita v'seira v'gemer, for it is written a land of wheat and barley. V'amar v'chanan, kol ha'posuk hazeh l'shiurin nema. This entire posuk was said for the purpose of teaching the laws of measures. Each of these 7 fruits is a unit of measure for some law. For example, chita, when the Torah says chita, wheat, mentioned in the verse lechidetnan anichas levais hamenuga, is needed to teach that which we learnt in the Mishnah in the Goyim 13:9. If one enters a tzaras afflicted house, but he has garments being carried on his shoulders, and his shoes and rings being carried in his hands, they are being carried rather than worn. Hu v'heim tmei miyad, both he and they, his garments, shoes and rings, become tamei immediately. But if he was wearing his garments, when his shoes were on his feet and his rings were on his fingers, hu tamei miyad, he becomes tamei immediately. But they, the clothing, the shoes, the rings, remain tar until he lingers. He stays in this tamei house, this tzaras afflicted house. He stayed there for achilas kedei achilas pas, which is between 4 to 8 minutes, the amount of time it takes to eat half a loaf of bread. Let's see if I was right. 26. It says the volume of 4 eggs, which is considered the normal amount of bread eaten by a person at a single meal. So it doesn't say exactly 4 or 5 or 8 minutes, but whatever amount would take you to eat half a loaf of bread. Pas chitim le pas se'erin, wheat bread rather than barley bread, meisev ve'echa belifton, eaten while he is reclining and eating the bread together with a relish. Bread is eaten more quickly when eaten together with a relish and the person is seated comfortably. So the word wheat, when the Torah says chita in the verse, indicates that wheat bread is to be used in measuring the duration of time that a person must remain in the tzaras afflicted house in order to contract the more severe tumah that extends to the clothing he is wearing. Now, seir or barley mentioned in this verse teaches the following measure. It's not etzem keseiro, for we learned in a Mishnah, a human bone the size of a barley kernel, metamev magum masa, imparts tumah to a person through contact or through being carried by the person, even if he does not touch it directly. But it does not impart tumah through being under a common roof. Geffen vines mentioned in the verse teaches the following measure. Kedei revis yain nozir, the amount of revis of wine for a nozir. Te'ina, figs, what do I learn from figs? Mentioned in the verse teaches the following measure. The size of a dried fig is the minimum amount of food for which one is liable for carrying it out from one domain to another on the Shabbos. And this is common. We learned it a lot many times. It says the size of a dried fig. What do we learn from Rimoin? Pomegranates mentioned in the pasuk teaches the following measure. Kedetnan. Kol klei vale botim shiurim karimoinim. As we learned in the Mishnah, Kalim 17:1, the measure of all homeowners' utensils to lose their tumah is a whole the size of a pomegranate. Okay. Eretz zei shemen udvash. What do we learn from this words? A land of oil producing olives and date honey. This teaches that Eretz Yisrael, Eretz shekol shiura kazesim, a land whose every legal measure is the size of olives. Whenever the law requires a minimum size, it is the size of an olive that is met. Kol shiura sakadaito. Can you really say that all its measures, or every legal measure has to do with olives? But there are those measures that we just mentioned above that are related to other fruits and not to an olive. Just mention, for example, chita, kedachilas pras. So it's a different measure. It's not an olive measure. Rather say a land whose majority of legal measures is the size of olives. Dvash, date, honey that is mentioned in the pasuk, the size of a large date is the. We know that honey comes from dates. The size of, in this, when the Torah says Eretz Zovas Chol V'Dvash, the Dvash is referring to, it's not honey that comes from bees, it's referring to the honey that is date honey. So the size of a large date is the minimum amount of food for which one is liable for eating on Yom Kippur. We see that the laws regarding standards of measure can be derived from a scriptural verse. How then could Rav assert that they were transmitted to Moshe at Sinai merely orally? But do you really think that this pasuk refers to measures? Are standards of measure actually written in this verse? Rather, the laws concerning standards of measure are in fact oral laws, which the rabbis supported with scriptural verses. The Gemara now questions Rav's assertion that the laws governing interpositions were transmitted to Moshe orally without any scriptural basis. Where the laws governing interpositions have a biblical source. For it was taught in a Baisa regarding the verse that it is written, and he shall bathe his entire body in the water. This teaches that there should be no extraneous matter interposing between his body and the water. The The words in the water teach that the immersion is to be in gathered waters. The words, his entire body, teach that he must immerse in a volume of water sufficient for his whole body to enter at one time. And how much water is this? The volume of an amma by an amma, the height of 3 ammas, 3 cubic ammas of water. And accordingly, the sages measure the water of a mikvah to be at least 40 seah. We see that the laws of interposition do have a scriptural basis, unlike Rav's assertion. The Gemara answered that indeed Rav agrees that the basic law of interposition has a scriptural basis. For what was the oral law necessary? What aspect of the law of interposition was given only orally without any scriptural basis? For the law that interpositions in one's hair can invalidate an immersion, as taught by Rabba bar Rav Huna. For Rabba bar Rav Huna said, a single knotted hair interposes. 3 hairs knotted together do not create chatzitza, do not interpose. But I do not know whether 2 hairs knotted together interpose, create chatzitza or not. So 1 does, 3 don't, and 2, I'm not sure. Rabbi Rav Huna's ruling thus assumes the basic premise that interposition in one's hair invalidates his immersion. And it was this basic premise that Rav asserts was taught orally to Moshe at Sinai. So, Nami Doraiso. But the law that immersion is invalidated by an interposition in one's hair has a scriptural source. That Tanya. It was taught in a Bais Berochas is called Besoroi, Leviticus 15:16. Berochas is called Besoroi, and he shall bathe his entire body. What is called Besoroi? Even something that is auxiliary, secondary to his skin, which is his hair. So we have a scriptural source for the law that interpositions on the hair invalidate an immersion. Accordingly, when Rav said that some aspect of the law of interposition is oral without any scriptural source, he could not have referred to the basic law of interpositions in the hair. For the what was it necessary for the oral law to come and teach? What oral law was referred to by Rav? Leruboy ulemeutoy ulemakpid ulechshein makpid. For the law of major part and minor part, and for the law of objection and non-objection. Laws which the Gemara now explain. As was taught by Rabbi Yitzchak, according to biblical law, an interposition that covers the major part to which one objects interposes and invalidates the immersion. But interposition to which one does not object does not interpose and invalidate the immersion. Biblically, even if it covers the major part. We know when it comes to washing our hands, so if you have dirt on your hand, you're not yetzer because it interposes. But if it's something that is always there, maybe you're a painter, then it would not be an interposition. But the rabbis decreed that interposition covering the major part, but to which one does not object, should invalidate the immersion. Mishum ruba makpid, on account that you have to follow the majority. Most people do care that they have these interpositions, which biblically invalidates the immersion. Makpid, and they also decreed that interposition covering the minor part, to which one does object, should invalidate the immersion. Mishum ruba makpid, on account of an interposition covering the major part, to which one does object, which biblically invalidates the immersion. The Gemara now questions Rabbi Yitzchak's statement, from which it emerges that when an interposition neither objectionable nor does it cover the major part, it does not invalidate the immersion even rabbinically. But why not decree also that interpositions chatzitza covering only the minor part to which one does not object should rabbinically invalidate the immersion? Mishum miuta makpid, on account of an interposition which covers the minor part to which one objects, which invalidates the immersion rabbinically. Or on account of an interposition covering the major part, but which one does not object, which invalidates the immersion rabbinically. The Gemara replies, He gufa gezerah. He gufa gezerah. It itself is an invalid immersion only by force of a rabbinic decree. Shall we then arise and enact a decree to safeguard what is itself a decree? Certainly not. Therefore, we do not decree against immersing oneself with an unobjectionable interposition that covers only the minor part. The Gemara questions Rav's assertion that the laws governing partitions were transmitted to Moshe orally without any scriptural basis. The laws governing partitions have a biblical source. The Holy Ark was 9 tefachim tall, as stated explicitly in Scripture. And the thickness of the lid, the kapiris, the covering, it was 1 tefach. So we have here a total 10 tefachim. From these dimensions, the Gemara in Sukkah 4b and 5a derives that the minimum the minimum height of a partition must be 10 tefachim. So the law of partitions has a scriptural basis, unlike Rav's assertion. The Gemara says, "Let's see Rabbi Yehuda, the oral law, it is necessary only according to the view of Rabbi Yehuda, the Omar Amas Binyan Ba'amo Bashisha, who says that the Amo units mentioned in the context of the tabernacle structure are Amos of 6 tvachim. What is Amos 6 tvachim? Amos Kelim Ba'amo Bas Chamisha, whereas the Amo units mentioned in the context of the tabernacle vessel are Amos of 5 tvachim. According to this view, the height of the Holy Ark, which was a vessel, was only 7.5 tefachim, and it cannot serve as a biblical source for the law that partition must be at least 10 tefachim high. If we adopt Rabbi Yehuda's view, we can explain that Rav meant that the law fixing a partition's minimum height at 10 tefachim is an oral law transmitted to Moshe without any scriptural basis. But according to Rabbi Meir, who says that all Amma units stated in the context of the tabernacle, whether its structure or its vessels, were given in terms of an average Amma, 6 tefachim. What can be said? Accordingly, the minimum height of a partition has a scriptural basis in the dimensions of the Holy Ark. What law concerning partition is biblical but without a scriptural basis? The Gemara answers Rabbi Meir, according to Rabbi Meir, what was necessary for the oral law to come and teach? What oral law was referred to by Rav? Legoid, for the law that allows us to extend a wall up or down. Ule lavud, and for the law of lavud, which allows us to view small gaps in a wall as closed. And for the law of a bent wall of sukkah, which we discussed yesterday. The Mishnah stated that a koiro is effective only if it is 20 amos or less above the threshold of the mavoi. The Gemara now discusses how the ground of at the mavoi's entrance can be raised or lowered to bring a korah that is too high or too low within the required range. So up till now we spoke about decreasing the crossbeam. How about elevating the ground?
Okay.
You understand? The other way around.
The platform. Okay.
If you elevate the ground, then if you put dirt in the entrance, so there's no more 20 tefachim. It's less than no more 20 amos. It's less than 20 amos. If the entranceway of the mavoi was higher than 20 amos, the koiro was above the 20 amos maximum set by the Mishnah. And one come to reduce it, the height of the entrance, by building up a platform or pile of earth under the korah so that it would be no more than 20 amis above the ground, and thus readily noticeable to people there. The Gemara says, how much must he reduce? How high must the ground be built up? The Gemara clarifies this very question by asking rhetorically, what do you mean how much you reduce? As much as he need. Why are you asking how much should he do it? Of course, he must reduce the height of the entranceway as much as is needed for the korah to be no higher than the maximum of maximum height of 20 amis.
Right.
You can see in the diagram the raised area.
Right.
Rather, the intended question was how much must its width be? How deep into the mavoi must this raised area extend? Does he have to raise the area just by the door, or he has to go like in the diagram that it goes really deep inside the mavoi? Rabbi Yosef Omar tefach. Rabbi Yosef he has to go in a tefach, a platform 1 tefach deep, which is equal to the depth of the korah. Abai Omar Arba. Abai said no, he has to go 4 tefachim. Almost like an am. What is the machlokes between Rabbi Yosef and Abai? Why Rabbi Yosef is tefach and Abai says 4? The Aman Domar tefach. According to Rabbi Yosef, who said tefach kasor mutar l'shtamish tachas hakorah, holds that it is permitted to carry directly under the korah. Therefore, it is sufficient if only the tefach of ground under the korah is raised. So in 38, to utilize this area, so Kasor mutar l'shtamish tachas hakorah holds, Rabbi Yosef holds that it is permitted to carry directly under the korah. Therefore, it is sufficient if only the tefach of ground under the korah is raised. Now, since the people carrying there will then readily notice the korah overhead and be reminded not to carry in the public domain beyond. Uman de'omar arbo, and the one and Abaye who said that the raised area must be 4 tefachim deep. Kasova also l'shtamish tachas hakorah holds that it is prohibited to carry directly under the korah. Therefore, the 20 amma high korah will not be readily noticed by people carrying in the mavoi unless a portion of the mavoi behind the korah is built up, so that the people carrying there will notice the korah. Abaye sets 4 tefachim deep as the required width of the platform.
Well, maybe we'll do the whole after tonight. So that
Okay.